So Ken, you've been part of some amazing companies and teams, from Zynga to Facebook to Google to your own company, and built some amazing analytics teams. I wonder if why don't we just start, like, walk me through step by step how you build out an analytics team from kind of the first hire to, probably scaling to an org like you had at Facebook and Google.
The three things you need to get right. The first one is, what are the types of people you need to hire? The second is, how do you structure them in the overall org? Where do you put those people? And the third one is, what's the culture that they're in, that they're creating, that they're going to be surrounded by?
Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit about that. Let's drill into those a little bit. What do you want to look for in, like, the right people?
The main thing that you look for is a little bit different than what I used to look for. I used to look for just pure analytic skills. Mm-hmm. And when we would interview people, I would drill them on their analytic abilities. Are they familiar with all the tools? How much do they know statistics? And ask them questions about that. The problem was, we ended up with a lot of people who had PhDs in these technical areas. And I started noticing, this was kind of back in my days at Zynga, that they were really good at coming up with these brilliant answers to questions that no one really cared about. They had this really academic approach to things. Yeah. So what we realized was we had to filter not just for those technical skills, but also business savvy itself. So kind of tactically, what we ended up changing, and I still do this to this day, is before you get into, tell me about your background in using analytic tools, in interactions with databases, asking things about statistics, the first thing I'll say is, so here's a challenge we have right now, and try and use something that's fairly realistic. Mm-hmm. We've got this product that we've released, and overall users is increasing, but engagement per user is decreasing over time. What would you look at? Assume that you could look at pretty much any data. Mm-hmm. Tell me what you would look at. What questions would you ask to figure out what's going on? Mm-hmm. So that figures out whether or not they have some of this business savvy to dive into what are the questions that they should ask. And then once they give you that, then you can say, all right, well, now how would you go about getting those answers?
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay, so is there an example of, like, a good question they might ask from a bad question, or does it just, the people with the business savvy, they know how to come up with the questions, and the people without the business savvy just don't know how to come up with questions?
It's much more the latter. It's not so much did they come up with really good questions, although there's certainly good versus poor questions. Mm-hmm. But it's, can they think about the business? Okay. Like, they can say, well, what time of year was it? Was this seasonal? Do you see this happen every year? Are they asking those kinds of questions? Yeah. And are you seeing that the population has shifted? That maybe you went from a developed market where they have a different demographic, then you're going to an emerging market, and that could give you very different types of metrics. And have you broken it out by different geographies? Mm-hmm. So you're just looking with, can they come up with hypotheses? Because from my experience, the difference between a good analyst and a great analyst is a good analyst can give you really good answers. A great analyst can also figure out the right questions.
Got it. Okay. And so have you found a pattern of, do the ones that are really good on the business savvy, do they come from a specific type of background over people who tend not to be as business savvy?
The thing that I try to look for, although there's as many exceptions as people who fall into this category, is people who just have operational experience. Mm-hmm. And people who might have had an academic background but have also spent time in a real business, dealing with deadlines, dealing with the fact that you can't always get to a perfect answer, you don't always have perfect information, how are you going to make a decision anyway? Mm-hmm. But you have to, since analysts are pretty in demand right now, you have to look pretty broad. At Facebook, one of the guys who headed up one of my analytics teams, he had a PhD in oceanography. Oh, wow. And the guy who ran the analysts, big chunk of my analyst team at Zynga, he was an economist. Okay. So you kind of have to just look at anything where data is core to what they do.
Got it.
So physicists as well, all these can work. So look well beyond the statisticians.
Yeah.
And personally, I don't even have a direct analytics background. It's just by years of doing it hands-on. So I would say go more broad than trying to narrow down on just one particular type. And rather than focusing on what their background is, focus on can they figure out the questions to ask and do they have the skills to answer those.
Got it. Okay. So do you think like the profile of that person changes from like a very small team to a potentially big team, or are you looking for the same qualities throughout the whole timeline?
One thing that doesn't change is you need people who have the combination of business savvy as well as technical skills. So that does not change. But if you're starting a team, what's the first hire? That person should be a very hands-on person. Because the question is, should I hire someone who's got experience building these teams and can lead this team versus do I just want to hire somebody who can get something done immediately and just build stuff but may not be able to scale to leadership? I would definitely fall in the category of bring in somebody who's just going to build stuff early on and hopefully they can scale. Mentor them if you can. If you can't, you will have to bring in somebody else, and that's just an organizational change you'll have to make. But what you really want to do is get somebody who can be hands-on early on and just start building out infrastructure, dashboards, reports, an experimentation platform. Those are the things you need to get going.
Okay. When do you think there's an optimal point at a company when to start like this team? Is it a certain company size? Is it a funding stage? Is it a customer mark, or is it just like start this from day one?
For me, I'm biased, but it's start this at start this at day one. I think a core product team should be PMs, analysts, designers, and engineers.
Okay.
And it would that question to me is a little bit like, well, what's the right time to bring in engineers? You need them day one.
Right.
Otherwise, you start spinning off in a direction that isn't very data-based. You start getting processes built that aren't reliant on data, and then you have to go back and change them.
Yeah, I'd love to come back to this because I feel like a lot of teams don't actually do that from day one. Like they actually,
no, absolutely true.
Yeah, and I'd love to come back and dig into like why you think that is. But we were talking a little bit about how you built the analytics team out, and you mentioned three things, right? Hiring the right people. The second thing you mentioned was about team structure. Tell me, like, what are some of the different team structures to consider? And my guess is there's pros and cons to them all.
Definitely. There's two classic team structures, and both have pros and cons. One is the decentralized structure, which I don't know the percentage, but roughly it seems like half the companies start off that way, where you've got different teams, and as they need analysis of whatever's going on in that part of the company, they hire an analyst to do that. So it kind of grows organically. The advantage of that is the people they hire, they're part of these particular team, so they're really aligned with the goals of that team. And can be really part of building that team.
So that's like an analyst on like the marketing team and maybe a product team and maybe like a biz ops team or something like that, right? Yeah. Okay.
The downside of that is because they are in all these different teams and aren't really working together, you kind of end up with chaos at an infrastructure level. Right. They'll build their own data warehouses or data stores. They'll start using all their own tools. They'll use their own definitions of what are we counting as a user? When are we saying revenue becomes actually revenue? How are we defining churn? All of these things. And everybody comes up with their own different approach to this. And this was kind of the state of the world when I joined Facebook. We had all of these different analysts in different teams, tons of data, but we didn't have a consistent view of, well, how many users did we actually have? You ask different teams and you get a different number. Some of it because they were just looking in wrong places. Others simply because things were defined differently. If I'm using Instagram and when I post to Instagram, I also have it post to Facebook. but I haven't actually logged directly into Facebook that day. Am I a user of Facebook that day or not? Do I count you or not? There's no right or wrong answer, but you better be consistent. And when you have all these different teams, you're not going to get consistent answers. The flip side of that is the centralized team. And that's the other half of companies start that way, which is we're going to build this up and build the infrastructure and have all the right processes. The advantage there is you can have shared standards and shared infrastructure and shared definitions. The downside there is the team tends to be not closely associated with the goals of any one team. And because of that, they tend to be a very reactive team in that model, meaning the other teams come to them and say, I need this report, and their job is just to give it to them, purely service. That's right, yeah. It's a service function. And so you're not getting full value out of the team at all. With that said though, if you're starting from scratch and it's a small company, I do think the centralized team is way better to start, even given the downsides. They both have downsides, but it's really important for long-term success that you build standardized definitions and processes and tools, infrastructure initially.
And that's the advantage of the centralized team, which is why you want to start there.
So I think you start there, and I also, it's a pretty strong belief of mine that even if you haven't started there, you have to go through that stage of being centralized if you're ultimately going to be successful with analytics. You may not end up there over time. There's all kinds of end places, but you have to at least go through that phase to build that kind of shared understanding of how we're using data in this company.
So it might even just be a temporary time period where it's like, look, we're going to act like a centralized team because we're going to standardize these things. We're going to answer all these questions. We're going to get the infrastructure cleaned up. And once we do that, then we might, span back out.
Then you will run into problems pretty quickly with this centralized structure, though. I mean, it works for a small enough team, but as it grows and as the company grows, you'll really start hitting the limitations of, but we're not really part of those teams. We're not aligned or really fully aware of what the goals are or what they're doing day to day to hit those goals, so we can't help as much as we otherwise would. And that's when I think you switch to the next model, which you have to have a little bit of scale in the analytics team before this works. But it's essentially combining decentralized and centralized. And a lot of people refer to that as the embedded model, where ultimately it is a centralized team on an organization chart. But the individuals don't sit with you. They break up into little groups and they sit with the different product teams or marketing teams or whatever. So it's a bit of the best of both worlds, where they're getting all of the insight into what's going on in those groups. They're at all the stand-up meetings in the hallway. They can figure out how to proactively help, yet they're part of a central organization, so they can make sure they have shared standards. You may not end there. That's the phase we went through at Facebook, but then after 3 or 4 years of that, we went back to fully decentralized. But at that point, we had all of the infrastructure in place. We had some really good processes. We knew how to hire analysts well, and we kept that as kind of a centralized function, actually. We knew how to manage careers for them. We had standard tools in place and definitions, but the teams were big enough that it made more sense at that point to split them up and be more of a virtual unit, but actually now report into the different business units.
Okay, so at Facebook you got there and it was fully decentralized.
And
you had
kind of chaotic.
Yeah, and you had some of these chaotic issues of inconsistent infrastructure and definition. And then it sounds like you went through a phase where it was all centralized, right? And you standardized all this stuff. You cleaned up the chaos, got some order to the chaos. But at some point you were in such a rhythm, right? Like that you were able to go back to the decentralized model.
We went through the centralization and then the embedded version of that.
Sorry,
and then things got to be quite good, where the downside of not actually being part of the specific teams that we were working with started to outweigh the benefit of now being centralized, because we'd solved most of the big problems. And so for Facebook, it made sense to then go back to decentralized. But the team was a few hundred people at the time.
Wow, that's that's definitely a big team. I'm interested. I know Zynga came before Facebook. Was Zynga similar? Did you go through similar phases?
Zynga is the first time I had experience with the embedded model, and they had kind of a decentralized way of starting up, but then very quickly went to centralized. And when I got there, I was managing a centralized team. And it was one of the guys on my team who suggested that, well, why don't we keep the centralized organizational structure, but push the teams out into, we called them studios at Zynga, which were the different teams that made the different games, so that they could have a lot more domain experience and essentially be assigned to a particular team and really be part of that versus an arm's length relationship of, I just need some data, can you please get it for me?
Yeah, okay, that definitely makes sense. I like the story because I don't remember who said this, but I remember reading this quote somewhere that's like, your org structure is never perfect. Like, it just constantly has to constantly evolve and iterate.
It is a pendulum. You go more centralized, more decentralized, because each has pros and cons, and I think you focus on whichever are the biggest problems until they're no longer the biggest problems and something else is, and you have to change the structure again.
Yeah. I feel like that's like everything in building a company. It's
Right,
like,
right.
it's like that consideration. All right, so building up the team, we talked a little bit about just like some of the core things you need to look for, the right team structure. The third thing you mentioned is culture. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's two things you really want to focus on, which this is probably the thing that, for me, differentiates really high-performing analytic teams versus those who aren't. And the first part is have the team focus on being proactive versus reactive. And we've talked a little bit about the reactive, which is you're just the service-oriented model. You certainly need to be doing some of that as an analytics team, supporting growth efforts and all other parts of the company. But you're only as good as the questions that people are asking you. And often they're not exactly sure what they should be asking you. They're asking you for data because the person who had their role before them asked for that data, and it just seems to be the thing to do. So have the team focus on making sure that they're not just providing answers, but also think up the right questions. So really what ends up happening there is, rather than just being involved at the end of a product release cycle to see how well this release performed, you have to get yourself involved at the very beginning of that product cycle too, to provide the data of, here are the growth opportunities that we should be focusing on. There's an issue in the product here. We have a particular flow that users are going through, but on step 3, we're losing 70% of the people there. We need to fix step 3. And we've been looking through the data to find all of these, and this one is particularly bad. That's the one we should be focusing on. As part of our roadmap, that's one of the things we need to do. And that's being very proactive. And having the team focus on that adds an order of magnitude more value than being purely a service team.
I imagine being proactive is probably a little bit easier in the embedded or the decentralized model versus the centralized.
It's almost impossible to centralize because you don't know enough about what the efforts are that are going on in the team. So as I mentioned earlier, when you're centralized, you do purely centralized, not the embedded model, you do tend to become highly reactive. Because you just don't have enough day-to-day experience in that particular business group, that domain, whatever it is they're working on. So that's one thing about culture, is focus on being proactive. The next thing that kind of ties in with that is the analysts have to own the outcome. And that is probably the one where you get the most pushback from the analysts.
Tell me a little about that.
What I mean by that is, by owning the outcome, is the benefit of analytics is that something has to change. It drives change. We've talked about historically in the analytics industry, it's all about delivering insights. That turns out to just not be correct. Insights are about driving understanding, but if I don't do anything with that understanding, if I don't do anything differently, then you add zero value to the company. I can give you all the information that I think you need, but if you don't do anything with it, ultimately it would have made no difference if I wasn't even at the company. Because you didn't change your behavior. So analytics has to be defined by what impact they had, not just the insights.
So how does an analyst own the outcome?
I
imagine the pushback on it from the analyst is, That's great.
But
I'm not actually one doing the coding or prioritizing the roadmap. That's the PM or that's the engineer, right? Like, I mean, so like, what's your response to that?
Well, yes, this is an influence role. You don't
Yeah.
own these things, but a fundamental part of being a good analyst, a high impact analyst, is you have to be good at influencing. So that's the first part of it. It's part of the role. You have to evangelize. The second part, which is kind of more tactical to focus on how to make that job easier for yourself, is, and this is why the embedded model is really important, the more you understand what the team is trying to do and what they have tried to do previously, the more you increase your chances that they will act on your recommendation. As an example, let's say that the thing that they're focusing on right now is we need to go big in international and support more languages and more geographies. So there's a whole bunch of things I could do if I have all the data at my fingertips here about what I can be analyzing. If I say, hey, I've got a great idea about looking at the data, there's an opportunity to monetize people a bit better than we are, that can be a very actionable thing that you may be presenting, but they're focusing on internationalization. So they're very likely going to say, we're not going to act on that. Or at least not now, that's not our focus. You're coming up with something that we're not focused on. If you come up with, instead, something like, here are the 2 or 3 regions we should be focusing on, and based on our current usage, and here are some of the key things that we need to change, that we're seeing, when we have done a little bit of international growth, here's what we saw in terms of differences in behavior and how the product may need to change to be successful in these new geographies, then they're going to be much more likely to act on it. So it is beholden, it is a responsibility of the analyst to pick the right things to analyze so that they will get acted on.
Okay.
I think the analogy that I've used is it's like a salesperson saying, I went to the customer and I gave a great presentation and I put together a beautiful proposal, and you can't blame me if they didn't buy. I don't control them. Right? Well, yeah, but you have to pick the right customer. You have to understand their needs and put something together that fits their needs. So it's the same thing here. You have to pick the right analyses that are in line with what is likely to be acted on.
Yeah, I mean, reminds me too, like in a lot of organizations, PMs actually don't own or like manage the engineers, and that's one of the common complaints, right? And it's a similar thing where they have to influence. I'm wondering if, like, let's pretend I'm like one of your analysts for a second, and I'm bad at the evangelizing thing. What type of coaching or tips would you typically give an analyst who's really good at coming up with the right questions and maybe finding the answers, but just is really bad at influencing other people? Are there things you would tell them?
Yeah, I think usually when an analyst is bad at influencing people, it's because their notion of influencing people is to deluge them with data.
Okay.
And you can kind of see where that comes from. It's they did all of this work, they want to show it to say, here are all these things we looked at to prove my point. But the thing that they should focus on is if I told you you could only show 1, maybe 2 charts in your entire presentation, which one would it be? Because they make the mistake that because they understand the data, everyone else they're trying to talk to will also understand the data. And you get totally sidetracked of them not understanding all the details of the data, and then you waste all your time trying to explain that instead of getting to the point of you need to do this. So come up with the 1 or 2 compelling charts or data points that said this is why we need to do it, and just focus on those 1 or 2. Have the other 15 things you did as part of the analysis to arrive at that conclusion in your appendix. But so the advice I give is narrow it down, focus on 1 or 2 things only. Don't try and show them all the hard work you did.
Yeah, I feel like if you get them bought in on those first 1 or 2, it'll naturally lead to follow-up questions, which is the 15 other charts in the...
But otherwise, with 15 things, it's too much for them to process. You spent a week or 2 or maybe even more understanding that, so it's second nature to you. It's not to them. Simplify it, simplify it, simplify it. That's really the message of how to be more convincing.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so How do you reinforce these things, like being proactive and making sure that you own the outcome on the team? Like, as the manager or the leader, like, what are you doing to make sure that the team is operating in that way?
The biggest thing you want to reinforce is that you are accountable for results. So, and it depends on the level of the analyst. A more junior analyst is a little less accountable. A more senior analyst, a lot of their performance review would be based very much on the impact, not on, gee, what kind of analyses did you do? It comes down to make sure the team celebrates wins in terms of having impact, not on doing cool analyses or complicated analyses or using the latest algorithm. Often, many really impactful analyses are very simple.
Yeah.
The brilliance comes in figuring out what the question was that you needed to ask. The answer could be simply just look at this piece of data, look at this piece of data, and divide the two. And that's really the metric that is going to drive all of this. So it's a simple SQL query or two and then a division. So there's nothing sophisticated about it. But again, the brilliance can come in figuring out this is what we need to be looking at and this is how we need to look at it.
Yeah.
So celebrating those wins, that's at a team level. At a company level, to focus on the fact that analytics needs to be about driving change, when you do get those requests for, hey, I need this data, unless it's purely an operational request of we want to track what our revenue is, but somebody wants to do more of an ad hoc query, I think you have every right and even more than that, a responsibility to say, okay, great, when you get the results of this analysis, what's going to change in the product or what's going to change in the company processes or how are you going to use it? Mm-hmm. And if they can't come up with that answer, then there isn't that much rationale for spending time on the analysis. Mm-hmm. If it's, well, I just want to see my gender split, male versus female in my user base. Okay, well, what are you going to do with that information when I get that? How do you think you might change the product? And the common answer is, well, I'll see when I get the data, then I'll figure it out. And then, but a very easy response there is, okay, well, either A will be greater than B, B will be greater than A, or they'll be equal. So let's talk about those three scenarios. Yeah. That's really the only three outcomes of this analysis.
And there should at least be a couple ideas in each category.
We're thinking about, and the notion is the analytics should be driven by, we're thinking about making this change, we're trying to figure out what's the best way to do it, versus I'm just going fishing, seeing if something interesting comes up. Occasionally those are interesting, but it's far more impactful to start with what is the change you're looking to make, and can you think through before we get started what change you will make. It just reinforces the notion of the purpose of this is we're going to change something later.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I feel like we focus a lot. So we focused on team, the people, the structure of the team, the culture of the team. But I feel like when most people think about analytics and data, the first thing that pops into their head is tools.
Right. Well, it's interesting because, and I didn't even mention that, which tells you a little bit about where I rank that in importance.
Right.
The things you do need when you're starting out are you need a way to do ad hoc queries, so some ad hoc query tool for analysis. You need a dashboarding tool for those things that are repeated queries that you need to run to see how are we doing today versus yesterday, what's the difference, what should we be doing about that. You need an experimentation platform so you can run tests because that's the lifeblood of growth. Yeah. And then the last thing you need is some kind of infrastructure where you can, in a fairly automated fashion, get refresh data on a daily basis.
Sorry, what's that last one again? So what would be an example of that?
I need something where the results, I just need to build infrastructure where I can refresh my reports on a daily basis.
Got it, okay.
There are lots of systems where it's manual, we only do it once a month, automate that. Got it. Or we have a process where by the time we capture the logs and then we process them and so on, and all these different things, it's 3 days later. Try as much as you can to be able to get to the data and the analyses you need within a day of events happening. People tend to move even more towards real-time analysis as well, which is even better, but try and get it so that you can get daily refreshes of the data. Make sure that you've designed the infrastructure so you can do that.
Yeah, I feel like it's easy to get lost in like tinkering with the tools and like the platform. Are there certain, if like an analyst or a data engineer came to you and was like, I really want to adopt this tool or build this thing, are there things you would ask them to make sure that it's time well spent?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big fan of using the shiny new tool. There's a cost to doing that, particularly if one person wants to do it, then you get into this scenario where that's the only person who knows that tool and no one else can kind of replicate what they've been doing. If you look at companies and their analytic performance, beyond having those first 4 tools that I talked about, ad hoc tools, dashboards, experimentation platforms, and infrastructure that does daily refreshes, there's very little correlation between the level of tools you have and the performance of the team. It's much more highly, which is why I didn't bring it up initially, as here are the things I need to look at.
I think that's really important. Repeat that real quick. Repeat that because I think that's really important for everybody to hear.
Once you get beyond the basics of those tools that I was talking about, ad hoc tool, dashboarding tool, experimentation platform, and an ability to refresh your data on a daily basis, there's very little correlation between the performance of an analytics team and the value they add and then the quality of tools that they have. People invest in all this new technology and try and get everything else that's out there. It isn't what really drives the power of analytics in the company. It is much more highly correlated to the culture that the company has about analytics is for driving change. It's not for insights alone, it's for driving change. I would much rather have a company with that culture and a lot of old servers running old technology, but they're really focused on we're proactive and we drive change versus all the latest multi-million-dollar tools, yet they're really doing it just as a service to other organizations.
Yeah, because wasn't the company you started, wasn't it an analytics tool company?
It was, yeah.
which is kind of ironic.
It is ironic, but you know, live and learn.
Yeah, that's right. All right, so I'm interested, like if you were dropped into like a Series B stage company, walk me through how you would evaluate if they had a healthy analytics culture and team.
Okay. The first thing I'd look at is the organizational structure, where analytics sits in the org. If they are underneath the engineers or if they're underneath the product managers, that tends to be a bit of a red flag for me because that means that they're not at an equal level. They don't have an equal seat at the table. For me, the core product team is analysts, engineers, PMs, and designers. You've got PMs, engineers, and designers all sitting around the table figuring out where the product should go next. You need to have analysts there too. If they're a sub-team under one of those teams, they tend not to be there because, oh, well, you know, the guy who's heading up that team is there. And then they become very beholden to, well, the PMs need us to do this, and they don't have the freedom to push back on PM, to push back on engineering if they're not at the same level. So that's kind of the first thing that they should, if there's a head of a particular product group, the head of analytics should report to the head of the overall product group rather than report to the head of engineering. That's certainly not always the case, but I think that's a bit of a warning sign. The second thing is, where are analysts involved in the product development process? Do they come in at the end, we've run an experiment, I need you to evaluate it, or do they come in at the beginning? We're defining the roadmap. We have the input from PMs on what's going on in the market. We have input from engineers on what we needed to improve our infrastructure. Design has their input. What's the analyst's input in terms of what we should be focusing on based on the numbers? A third thing is, how is the team measured? And this goes back to, do they own the outcome? Are they measured on the quality of the analyses they're doing? Are they measured on, look, we are focused on improving engagement or improving acquisition. Did those things improve? And if so, you did really well. And if not, it doesn't matter so much that you did great analytics. You were analyzing the wrong thing.
Yeah, are you talking about just like the analyst team, or are you talking about like the entire product team?
Well, I'm talking about the analyst team specifically, that the product team should also be measured on that, on the outcome, but the analyst team typically is not measured on the impact on metrics.
Right.
And I think they absolutely should be. And the teams that do really well are the ones that tie their, they think about their performance reviews. They're going to be measured on how well we did moving a particular metric, changing a product. What was the impact of what we did? Not just we were able to turn around 242 reports this quarter. So are they focused on impact? So that's another thing I would look for. A fourth thing I would look for is when you have these weekly meetings about the product, is a review of the data a core part of every meeting? And most teams will start with, who do this really well, we're going to spend the first 5 or 10 minutes talking about what happened last week and why. Not just, oh, we're up, we're down. It's we're up and this is what we believe caused it. Or we don't know yet, but we're looking into it. So it's reinforcing the fact that this data is really important to what we're doing and it should help drive our future direction. And I think the last thing is an interesting one. I like to see arguments between analysts and engineers and analysts and PMs. I like to see them arguing, which also doesn't happen as much if they report to the engineers or to the PMs, right? So now you're arguing with your boss versus arguing with a peer. That tells me that they have a seat at the table, and also that the PM and the engineer cares enough to actually have a debate with them versus just brushing them aside.
That's interesting. I imagine too, going back to the outcome, like whatever the analyst is measured against needs to ultimately be aligned to what some of the other guys are measured against as well. Okay, so that makes sense. So I feel like a lot of engineering or product teams, they kind of either ignore the data or they don't really operate with the data. Why do you think that's the case?
There's a lot of reasons, and this happens a lot. I can bucket them into generally 2 big categories of what's going on. The first one is the scenarios where they're just not using data. They're not really doing analyses. And the second one is they are doing analyses, but they're not really acting on the results. And there tend to be different causes. In the first one, when they're just not doing analyses, a few different causes. One is that the cultural aspect of it, that the belief in that company is product development is a purely creative process. It's about PMs figuring out what are the next great features. It's about engineers building cool things. That's you end up with that culture if you don't start with analytics early on, because that's the only way they have been building it. So you would be requiring them to change. So they just like what they've been doing in the past. So it's this notion of it's a creative process, not sure where you can't build something beautiful purely by looking at a spreadsheet. The second part that I would also call cultural about just not using data is there's the notion that a lot of engineering teams and PM teams measure themselves on, we set out to build this product and launch it, and our performance, how well we did, how we think about it is, did we successfully launch it? When you use data, suddenly you're now accountable for the results of the launch, not just the launch itself. It's, did you actually move the metrics that you set out to, which is why you built the thing that you launched in the first place. So it adds a whole new level of accountability that takes some getting used to, and people can push back on that. There's a whole other category, which this was kind of the case when I joined Facebook. There were some teams that just weren't using the data, even though there was tons available, because they don't trust the data. That's more of a tactical issue. Like, hey, we would love to use the data, we don't trust it. And in many cases, they're right. It's not trustworthy data. In a lot of cases, they're not right. They're just using that as an excuse for one of those cultural reasons. But I think those are the issues you run into, and addressing each one of those is a little bit different.
So that's what I was going to ask about. Like, if the team was more of they view the product development as purely a creative process, how would you address that or manage that conversation?
I would focus on positioning analytics as I'm not saying that we should design products on a spreadsheet. I don't think that that works. You have to position it as not a replacement for the process you've been using, but purely complementary. You have to have this creative aspect to it, and you also have to have this data-driven aspect to it. And you have to figure out there's always this, I think, beneficial tension between the two in terms of how you prioritize which ones. But you need to do both. And so positioning it as purely complementary versus competitive to the way you've been doing things, then the next thing that you need to be doing in parallel is start doing something proactive. Look for an opportunity, look for identifying opportunities for growth, bringing that to the product team, and coming up with that 1 or 2 charts that can help convince them to act that, yeah, this is actually going to be beneficial to get more people through our onboarding process or get more people engaged earlier on. And as soon as you can show them that this is beneficial in addition to what they're already doing, that is kind of the breakthrough moment where you can really then start getting the culture you need.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to put all the blame on product too. I feel like this problem can certainly exist with marketers too.
Oh yeah, exactly.
It's a fully creative process.
Yeah, and marketing, exactly. It's the coming up with, what is the right copy for this, and how do we want to creatively position this marketing campaign. Whereas the notion of you can't, that it's very, very creative in that sense, where the notion of I'm not going to be able to do this through analytics, but marketing also has to be just as accountable and be able to do A/B testing and show which one generated more lift than the other.
How do we? And so the second thing, like, how would you address the where they just don't trust the data?
Yeah, okay, that's a tactical issue, and I actually think if that's the case, before you do anything, it's not even worthwhile to try and focus on the culture until you address the tactical issue. And there you just have to spend the energy going through step by step, making sure that the data is correct. And what we did when we were at Facebook, also doing this when I joined Google, is go through end to end what happens, the life of an event that happens and how you're logging it. Go through the logging code and have somebody eyeball the code and review the code to make sure we're logging when we should be logging. Look at the table structures themselves. Is it getting logged the right way? Look at the reports. Are they querying the tables correctly? Are they filtering for only users who are signed in, or are they looking at all users? So kind of those 3 things: the login code itself, the table structures, and the dashboards. Validate those. And then the other thing that you can do if you have multiple ways of trying to get at the same answer is look at the same answer from multiple perspectives. Like you can have the number, if you want to count the number of users, you can look at the number of people who logged in that day. You can also look at the number of unique IDs that sent queries to your server. Because you might be missing a login event somewhere. So if you see that I only had 100 logins, but I had queries to the server from 110 different unique IDs, something's wrong there. So you have to validate that and make sure that they ultimately match.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. So it's really about just like starting at the source and walking all the way through to the end report. And then if you can do that from multiple different perspectives and align them, then like that's even better.
Right, if you're triangulating and saying, look, all roads are leading to the same numbers, the same results, then you can go back to the team and say, here's the work we've done. Would like you guys, whichever team you're talking to look through this and make sure it makes sense to you. And then you kind of have that as a baseline now that there's trust. Then you can focus on whatever cultural issues you may need to focus on.
Yeah, so I feel like one of the other common tension points is just like, if you operate just with the data, you'll eventually lead to sacrificing the user experience. You touched on this a little bit, but just wondering if you could talk to me a little bit more.
Yeah, that's a really common comment. And I think that's just a persistent misconception. That probably isn't going to go away anytime soon, but it definitely is a misconception. The notion is that, we're going to just start spamming the user with notifications, or we're going to flood them with emails, or we're going to have pop-ups everywhere. And that's going to really hurt the user experience. If you've got the right metrics, the ultimate way of thinking about this is, and what will be true if you've got the right metrics is, if it's bad for the user and bad for the user experience, it's ultimately bad for growth. Now the challenge is somebody will say, well, we threw out a whole bunch more notifications and we saw a bump in engagement or whatever it may be. You can see wins in the short term, but it never lasts.
Yeah, it's the time horizon.
That's right. So if you look longer term, if they are ultimately annoyed by that, they will use the product less over time.
Yeah.
So there really isn't a huge incentive to do the wrong thing for the user, because it's a short-term win to juice your numbers, but it will absolutely come back to haunt you, and it will end up being more negative than positive in the long term. And then the second thing is, I would never suggest that we purely rely on analytics and data to drive product development.
Okay.
As we were talking about before, it has to be this tension between the creative part and the analytics part. Either one by itself is nowhere near as successful as both together.
Yeah. Who do you think in a healthy organization ultimately solves that debate, or like makes the final decision about that debate?
There should be a person who is in charge of that particular product overall, and that person has engineering and PM and analytics and design reporting into them.
Okay.
And that's the person who should be responsible for that decision.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about mostly like analytics teams to this point, and you've operated in a lot of orgs like Facebook and Zynga that have had growth teams. So it feels like you've not only sat alongside them as a critical piece, but also now you're starting to build a growth team at Google. Tell me just a little bit about how you're approaching that process at Google now.
All right. At Google, when I first got there, they had very much taken a decentralized approach to growth.
Okay.
There was a company focus on growth, and company annual goals were focused on growth, and each team had their growth goals. And then it was left up to each team to figure out how to do that, which at a high level sounds great, and give people autonomy. But everyone was kind of reinventing the wheel. They weren't exactly sure what to do. There was no shared learning about what tends to work and what doesn't. There was no focus on growth as a process. And it was just, well, let's come up with a whole bunch of ideas, put them on Post-it notes on a whiteboard, and then let's vote for it. So
when you say reinventing the wheel, was it reinventing the wheel of like how to approach growth, or tools, or other aspects?
It's more the former. Like, you'll have 4 or 5 different teams do analysis and then realize that one of the first things we need to focus on is the onboarding process. And they'll come up with an optimal way for creating an onboarding process. You'll have 4 different teams who spent energy doing that same thing and coming to the same conclusion.
Got it. Okay.
So it's a little less about tools and more about they just keep independently discovering the same things, which is a waste of resources and time.
Right. Okay. So somewhat similar problems to the decentralized approach of like an analytics.
Yeah. No. It's very similar to it, where there's overlapping efforts and often conflicting results too.
Yeah. Okay.
So what we tried doing initially with that approach was, okay, we have these teams, and the most common approach was, okay, you 4 people, you 6 people, you're going to focus on growth. So could you meet twice a week and talk about what we need to do for growth, and then drive getting that implemented? That just didn't work.
Why is that?
Growth can't be something that you do in 20% of your time.
Okay.
The lesson I learned was it has to be people focused on it full time. We were trying to get everybody to spend a little bit of their time on growth. The problem was they already had their full-time jobs, and now we're asking them to do something in addition. That was the first problem, and they just never found time for it. It was always something everyone wanted to do, but it's not like they had a lot of free time to begin with. So just structurally, that wasn't going to work. And then the second thing was growth it can be a really tough job, because so much of what you try in growth doesn't work.
Okay.
It's this highly iterative process, right? And a lot of it just doesn't work. So if you're an engineer and you're building stuff and launching stuff, and then part of your job is also working on this growth stuff, you may be very excited about it initially, but after running your first 2 or 3 experiments where the metric didn't move, you get disheartened.
Yeah, especially in comparison to this other thing.
That's right, where I built this cool thing and I launched it, and I can say, look at what I built. Now I keep trying these experiments and they don't seem to be working. I don't think this whole growth notion really works, and they just naturally start to drift from it. So rather than taking these big teams and saying everybody spend 20% of your time on this, what we ended up doing and what ultimately worked much better was just get a small group of people saying you are 100% focused on this.
Okay.
So you don't have to worry about your prior workload.
Yeah.
We'll figure out how to handle that, but you don't have to piss off people who you've been supporting for a long time and now say, I can't support you as much because I have these new responsibilities. It's the, you know what, I'm moving on to a different role, which is a much cleaner way to cut it. And then because you're 100% dedicated to this, it's not so easy to say, you know what, I just give up. And I'm going to focus on the other part of my job. This is 100% of your job now. There is no other part. You have to keep coming back to this.
And was that very early? Once you made that switch to 100%, who was that small pod? What skill sets were they? Mostly analysts, engineers, PMs, design, cross section, marketers.
Yeah, I think the 4 skill sets that you need, as I mentioned a little bit before, like kind of a minimum viable team.
Yeah.
Is 1 analyst, 2 engineers, 1 PM, and 1 designer.
Okay, all right.
And that's the minimum team you need. I think if you can't cobble a team that size together to be dedicated to growth, it's not going to succeed, and you're going to start to come to the wrong conclusion that, oh, well, growth doesn't work for us. We tried it, it didn't work.
It's just set up in the
right,
wrong
you're
way.
set up to fail, so you can't really conclude that growth won't work for you.
Any reason why you think it's set up to fail if you can't cobble together that initial team?
Because, well, first of all, if you don't have people 100% dedicated, as I was saying before, you have those issues. And then, well, I have a PM 100% dedicated on it, but he doesn't have or she doesn't have engineers who are dedicated to this. Then they have to spend too much of their time focusing on trying to beg, borrow, and steal engineering time and resources to get their thing built. And those engineers are thinking about, I have these other things on my roadmap that I have to deliver. I don't have time to do these other things for you.
Right.
So it just massively frustrating.
Right. Okay. That definitely makes sense. Okay. So it sounds like you got this little group together and things started working better. What was kind of like the next steps from there? Yeah.
So I started initially focusing on doing this in the search team at Google.
Okay.
And we finally got to a structure and a process that worked, where we had a smaller team that was dedicated. And what we're doing now is we've now created a centralized team that I'm chartered with building that's focused on replicating that process through the different product teams that we've got, marketing and product teams. What have we learned about growth? And helping the other teams ultimately get to a point where they all have their own dedicated, highly successful product teams, and then the focus of the centralized team there, this essentially becomes the embedded model again, is to tie all of that together, share best practices, provide services, and help teams get up to speed and coordinate all the actions, but then each team has dedicated resources in their teams to focus on the growth aspect of product development.
Any lessons learned as you've tried to go and train and kind of repeat these pods?
The biggest one for me is that you shouldn't even bother to get started if they say, I can't dedicate those people right now. Then, okay, that's fine, right? It just won't be successful. So I guess the nice thing is that doesn't bother me too much right now because I don't have the resources to work with every team yet. So I can try and work with the teams where I think we can have the biggest impact. That's the first cut at who we should be focusing on. But the second and very important cut is, and who also wants to work with us? Some people aren't fully bought into the model yet. For some things you said before, that growth is going to be harmful to the user experience. And don't focus on those teams yet.
Your time is better spent elsewhere.
That's right.
So ultimately, like we talked a little bit about kind of what you looked for on the analytics team, but when it comes to the growth team, is there a different set of attributes that you're starting to filter for?
It's certainly different from the analysts themselves. I think the key things I would look for is first, do they have a passion for data and products?
Okay.
I think anyone in a growth team should have some element of analyst in their DNA and some element of PM in their DNA. That may not be their focus, but they have to at least have some passion for those functions and those roles, and certainly an understanding of what those roles do and how to work with them.
I feel like that blend is hard to find because most people tend to live on the ends of the spectrums, right? Like it's hard, right?
It is definitely hard to find. In the same way, it's hard to find analysts who have good business experience as well.
Right.
But it's becoming less hard as people are realizing that's what they need. And you're seeing companies, and in fact, there are whole standalone companies now for analysts. I haven't seen them for growth yet. But what they will do is take someone who has a PhD in some related analytical field and put them through 6 weeks of
very intensive
training on the business part of it
Yeah.
and the real world part of it. And then they'll present them to companies and try and get them hired in different places.
Yeah.
So we're seeing kind of these crash course mini universities that are doing this now because people are realizing the need. So as more of that happens, and we're seeing even in universities that their analytics courses now, a third of the time is now focused on the business issues. They're putting presentation skills into analytics core curriculum, which I think is great. And so many other things that are needed as well are now being taught. So it's going to be a problem for a while, but people have realized it's a problem and it's slowly being addressed.
Okay, so that balance between the passion of products and data, that's one key thing. What else are you looking for?
The second one, and this one is really important for me, is that they see growth as a process. There's too many people who I think take the term growth hacking a little bit too literally, where they start thinking about it as it's experimenting, it's trying cool things, it's clever tricks and hacks, it's finding the magic bullet and finding that killer feature. That's what really drives growth. When I think if you look at any company that has consistently delivered growth, what you'll see is that they have a process in place that they can iterate on. It's a data-driven, highly iterative process that if you follow it, you get growth. You may get a small amount, you may get a large amount, but you will get growth. It's not about brainstorming and seeing who can come up with the right clever idea. There are things to look at. What do you analyze first? How do you prioritize what you're going to develop? Focusing on optimizing funnels, focusing on optimizing engagement loops and acquisition loops, all of these things. So you want to make sure that the person thinks about growth as a process overall, and the way to check for that is in the interview, you'll ask them, or you should ask them, so what is your growth process? How do you approach it? And if their comments are all scattershot, they don't really have a process. If they say, well, the first thing that we need to do is X, and then we move on to Y, like, hey, we're going to define a core metric first, then we go build growth models, then we prioritize things in the following manner. It doesn't matter so much whether you agree with the process. Do they have a process?
Yeah, one of the things that I sometimes do is I purposely lead them down a hole and then ask that question to see if they pop back out.
Right.
Or do they automatically go to the scattershot approach?
Right.
What else? I'm interested. What other kind of questions or things you do to evaluate for those things?
I think the third big thing would be they have a relentless focus on driving user value as measured by growth metrics, not as measured by what cool features do we have and so on. There is definitely a need for that, but the growth team should really be focused on I measure my success and how much value I'm adding to the user by moving these particular growth metrics and focusing on that impact. And the way I get at that is, so tell me about the biggest impact you've had on growth. And if they're talking about we were able to move X from this metric from X to Y, great. And then you ask them how they did it. Or if they say we impacted the product and we were going to go down this route, but instead we went down this other route, that's also real impact, real change. So ask them what the metrics are that they've been able to move and what the biggest impact is that they've had and how they've done it.
Okay, that makes sense. So I feel like one common challenge, and this is a question we always get, is about keeping engineers motivated to work on growth initiatives. I got to put those in quotes because it has so many different definitions. But I'm wondering how if you've come up against this problem, and if so, like how you've approached it.
Yeah, I think it happens quite a bit where you'll see people who kind of get excited by the notion and then get disillusioned. Because expectations weren't set correctly. They're feeling that I'm going to be building stuff and I'm going to see the results every time I launch a new experiment. So I already mentioned that as a foundational thing, you want to make sure that those engineers are 100% focused on growth. I'd rather have a small number fully focused on growth than a very large number doing it 30% of the time. But with that as baseline, it's about setting the expectations that what we need to measure our success on is, did we move the metric ultimately? And think about it as, we are trying to simplify a particular flow. Let's come up with 5 different ways that we think we should do that. We don't know which one's right. So it's not that we launched the first iteration of one out of those 5 and it didn't work and then I get disheartened. It's like, we're not done yet. The experiment isn't done yet. It's just one iteration of it. But the notion is, if any of those 5 actually move the metric, then it's the now you succeed. I think the biggest problem right now is they just go from, I launched stuff, I feel good about it, to now I'm launching stuff, I'm measuring it, it didn't move anything, I feel bad. It's no, you ultimately got to a place where the metric moved, and also putting the culture in place that if you get it right the first time, let's just consider that luck. It is an iterative process, and so focus on the final impact, not on the potentially failed experiments along the way.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So you mentioned a couple of times that you're working on growth for Google search. I think most people's gut reaction would be, why does Google search need growth? It seems like the last thing that needs growth. So I'm wondering just like how you and your team are thinking about that.
Okay, yeah, that was probably my first thought too when I got approached with the opportunity. And the reality is that's a very Northern California-centric way of thinking about it.
Fair.
And there are 2 important dimensions of growth for search and for all kinds of products as well that are enormous. Where we're not going to focus too much is, we have 90% of the world's search market overall. It's not particularly exciting to me or the company to get that to 95. That's not the kind of growth that's going to get anyone excited. But most of that is coming from the developed markets in the world. If you look at the emerging markets, a lot of them have never even heard of search. You give them an app to do search in that white box, and they have no idea what it is. The notion of, I know what search is, I know the Google search box, it's iconic, is not iconic in these other markets. They think the app never finished rendering because all they got was a white box, and there was nothing to do. They didn't know what to do. So one is growth in emerging markets. There's huge opportunity there in terms of the percentage of people right now in India who open up Google search, do absolutely nothing. They don't type anything. They close it and never ever open up search again, is astonishingly high. Too embarrassed to tell you what the number is. So there's huge opportunity there. The other one is, on average, if I were to say people search worldwide 10 times a month, I think you and I probably have done 10 times since lunch. So that's huge growth there. If I can go from 10 times a month to 100 times a month to 1,000 times a month. So I can 10x the number of queries that are being run in search. So those 2 dimensions about addressing the people who aren't using search at all right now and the people who are using it, there's so many more ways that Google can add value to what you're doing every day that you're not using it for yet, often because you're just not aware that that value is even there. There's huge growth there too.
Yeah, just goes to show that growth is never done. Even if you're as big as Google search.
That's right. There's always pretty big dimensions for growth.